Volunteers and draftees, North and South. Okay, so first let's talk about the people actually fighting the war. We'll start in the North. So at first, all of those in uniform, all soldiers, were more or less volunteer. States had a quota based on their population they had to fill, but after a while, by 63, a couple years into the war, we see less and less volunteers. So we actually passed the first draft law, forcing people to join the war effort, and that's called a conscription law. So this conscription law actually was really favored the rich folks, because if you had enough money, you could actually hire a substitute. So you could pay for somebody to go to war in your place. Or you could literally just pay $300 and kind of purchase an exemption from the draft. Okay? So the poor really complained that the government was demanding $300 or your life. So not a lot of the poor people were super excited about this new draft, and we get some riots. So most notably in New York City, we have the New York draft riots. And what it was, like I said, New York City, it lasted several days. It was a mob of mostly Irish Americans who spent time, rioting and pillaging. And, a lot of people died in this riot. And remember, the Irish were very anti-black because they saw slavery as, or they saw black labor as a kind of a competition for their jobs. So there was even some lynching during this riot. So the New York draft riots really a response to the injustice of the draft. Sure. Okay, but when all said and done, yeah, they did draft folks, but in the North, about 90% of those fighting for the North were actually volunteers. And there was a lot of social pressure to volunteer, and over time, they started to give people who would enlist money. So at one time, you could get up to $1,000 if you enlisted or signed up for the army. And because of this, we have these people called bounty jumpers who start to make an appearance. Okay, so what people would do, these bounty jumpers, is they would enlist, pocket the money, and then desert. So then they would enlist again somewhere else, pocket that money, then desert. There was a record of one man who actually did this 32 times. So this was a problem kind of attached to the draft as well, or to recruitment, I guess you should say. So let's talk about the South now. So the South, same thing. At first, it was mostly volunteers, but because the South had less people, they ran out of volunteers sooner. So the South was kind of desperate for people. So the South more or less determined anyone fit for service. Their age ranges was 17 to 50. So the South started conscription or the draft earlier, like I said, than the North because they had less people. And then like the North as well, you could hire a substitute or you could pay for an exemption. So a lot of people in the South also complained, right? This was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And the people in the South, or the poor people in the South, were saying, why risk your own neck for, to save your neighbors, to save your neighbor's slaves? They saw this as an issue with slavery, and they're like, we don't even own slaves. Why are we fighting this kind of rich man's war? But we don't really see many riots in the South, and I think that's mostly due because the recruiters, or those kind of enforcing the draft, really steered clear of those mountain regions that had those white mountain men in them. So the recruiters knew better than to mess with these kind of pro-North white mountain guys. All right, next section. The economic stresses of war. So we're talking about money, okay? So the North by far had more wealth, so they fared a lot better during the war than the South would. North raised money for the war in different ways. For the first, they had a tax on tobacco and alcohol, and they used that tax money to fund the war. They also, for the first time in history, had an income tax, so you were taxed based on how much money you made. They created a higher tariff or a higher tax on imported goods. That was called the Morrill Tariff Act. So this tariff act increased the tariff to about 5 to 10%, but later they'd actually increase the tariff much higher just to fund the war. Another thing the North did is they started to print paper money. These were called greenbacks, okay? Greenbacks is what I'm saying. So they're printing this paper currency called greenbacks, but the greenbacks weren't fully backed by gold, so the value quickly depreciated or went up and down, fluctuated, you should say. So at one point, at its lowest point, these greenbacks were only worth, 39 cents on the dollar. So if you had one greenback worth $1, it was only really worth about 40 cents. So you could see this was a problem. But the North, the way they got their money mostly is by borrowing it. Okay, so they did have some taxes, but really this money for war came from borrowing it. And this is kind of what the system they set up. So they got about $2.6 billion through the sale of war bonds. Okay, so what a bond is an IOU from the government. So say you pay the government $50. You get an IOU that says, I owe you $70 in 10 years. So I would actually earn money by buying this bond, but I would just have to wait 10 years or so to cash it in. So through selling these war bonds or through these IOUs, the government, the Northern government, was actually able to raise $2.6 billion. All right. So also kind of to go along with these bonds or these IOUs, we have to talk about the national banking system. So we're not talking about the Bank of the United States. That was during Jackson's era. What we're talking about is kind of more of an effort to unite all of these independent banks we had out there. So in 1863, so a couple years into the Civil War, Congress authorized a national banking system. And they did this for two reasons. One, they wanted to standardize the currency, and two, they wanted to have places to sell these war bonds. So what would happen is a bank, an independent bank that would join the national banking system, they could, one, sell war bonds and make a slight profit off of doing that, and two, their banknotes or their IOUs, their currency, would be backed by the national government. Okay? So this is kind of the biggest step towards a national bank that we've had since Jackson killed the Bank of the United States. And this national banking system lasted for about 50 years until 1913, when we actually replaced that with the Federal Reserve System that we have in place today. So yeah, economy in the North. Well, let's talk about the economy in the South. Oh boy. All right. So the Southern economy was not doing so hot, okay? The Northern blockade really cut off any money they could have raised through tariffs because they're not importing goods. Clearly you can't tax imported goods, okay? The Confederates also sold bonds, and they raised about $4 million that way, but obviously not quite as much as the North had raised through this bond system. The South increased taxes a little bit. They put a 10% tax or levy on farm produce, but when all was said and done, only about 1% of their income, or the Southern income, really came through taxes. What they started to do was kind of a bad deal. They started to print their own paper money, and these were bluebacks, and really they printed this money with complete abandon. Okay, this money they didn't even pretend it was connected with gold or was backed by currency. So when all was said and done, they printed about $1 billion worth of worthless money. And this led to a huge increase of inflation. So before, say bread cost $1, because all of this kind of worthless money was floating out there, now that same loaf of bread might cost $40, seeing that inflation. Also, something to note is that, by the end of the war, one Confederate dollar was only worth about 1.6 cents. So while there was, definitely a depreciation in the value of greenbacks in the North, it wasn't at all as severe as the inflation and the depreciation we see of the Confederate currency. All right, next section, the North's economic boom. All right. So the war was actually quite good for the Northern economy, which is kind of a strange thing to say, but let's talk about it, okay? Because of this new high tariff, these tariffs were actually high to make money, but because of these high tariffs, that really was good for the new factories that were starting to be created in the North. Because of the high tariffs, people were more likely to buy these American-made goods. So these high tariffs kind of equaled an increase in factory production, you could say. And although there was inflation was actually led to huge profits for business people and for manufacturers, kind of at the expense of the laboring class. But nonetheless, the Civil War really created kind of a new class of millionaires. We see a lot of people become very wealthy, especially in the North during the Civil War. And the reason they made this money, however, was kind of iffy. For example, people might sell old or blind horses to the Union Army. They might sell shoes with cardboard soles instead of leather soles. They might make uniforms, but make them out of very cheap wool. So kind of a lot of people became millionaires, but kind of through this kind of immoral means of selling the Union Army this kind of second-rate stuff. And talking about the economy, although we lost a lot of the workforce to the war, so a lot of men left, their jobs to work or to become soldiers, that was okay because we had these kind of labor-saving machines make up for it, especially like the sewing machine. One sewing machine could do the work of, 4 different people. So these machines, this mechanization really kind of took the place or made up for the loss of people we had in our workforce due to the war. Even in the West, it's just not machines in factories, but also remember the McCormick Reaper enabled farmers to produce a lot more or harvest a lot more grain, a lot more crops than they had been before. So although we had a lot of farm boys going off to war, that was still okay because this reaper allowed us to produce a lot more as well. Also during the war, we discover oil in Pennsylvania, so we kind of have an economic boom from finding this oil in Pennsylvania. A lot of people rush into that area to start mining it. We passed the Homestead Act in 1862, which said for $30 an acre, you could buy a homestead or 160 acres, and only if, though, you were to live on that land for 5 years and improve it in some way. That usually meant like building a house, starting a farm, that sort of thing. So this Homestead Act really caused a lot of migration to the West, even during the war. So during the war, we have about 300,000 people moving to the West and starting to farm and improve this land. So that was another boom to our economy. So although you would think that during a war our economy would be really bad, it was actually through a number of things, like I said, discovering oil in Pennsylvania, opening up this western land through the Homestead Act, increasing the tariffs leading to better or more factories. All of this stuff kind of put together really led to a boom in industry in the North. Okay, so while we're talking about the Northern economy, we also have to talk about women's place kind of in the war and in the war economy. So a lot of women took the jobs of men who were away fighting. For example, there are about 500 women who became clerks in Washington, D.C. during the war. A lot of women actually started working in factories or in industries that created, shoes or produced shoes and clothing. So before the war, about 1 in 4 factory workers were women, but during the war, about 1 in 3 factory workers were women. So we see women kind of flooding into these factories to take the place of the men who are away fighting. There were some women who disguised themselves as men and actually fought in the war. We have record of about 400 of 400 women who would disguise themselves and fight in the war right alongside the Union soldiers. Also, some women worked as spies during the war. Crazy. Another thing that women really helped out with was kind of the medical field or the nursing field. The U.S. Sanitary Commission was created in 1861 in part by America's first female doctor, Elizabeth Blackwell. So this the U.S. Sanitary Commission, really what they did is they trained women to become nurses and helped collect medical supplies to make sure that hospitals were well stocked. So through this, it gave women the organization skills and confidence they needed to really propel the women's movement forward after the war. We have some famous names like Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix, who are both kind of like the head nurses of the Union Army. And they really transformed the nursing profession into a respectable one, really opening up the nursing field to many women after the war. And other women, they would organize bazaars or fairs to raise millions of dollars in relief for widows, disabled soldiers, orphans of the war, that sort of thing. So women really did make an impact in the war effort as well. All right, last section, a crushed cotton king. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the Southern economy. So economically, the war just crushed the South's economy. That's not very surprising. Okay, we've got the blockade, really cutting out the export or import of any goods. And remember, a lot of the war was actually fought in the South, so huge destruction of property in the South. Before the war, the South's per capita income was about 2/3 of the North. So say a northern person made $100. That would equate to about the average Southerner making $67. Okay, so that was before the war. But after the war is even worse. So after the war, or during the war, Southerners only made about 2/5 of the average Northerner. So if the average Northerner made $100, the average Southerner would only make about $40. So we see a huge discrepancy in the amount of money kind of in the hands of the Northerners and the Southerners. Also, during the Civil War, transportation just collapsed in the South. They would actually pull up railroad tracks from less used routes or less used rails to actually fix the main lines. So they would actually pull up a railroad track here and move it across the state to fix another railroad track over here. So really, their transportation was just kind of falling to pieces. But, throughout the whole war up to the very end, the South really did have a spirit of resourcefulness. They made do the best they could. An example of that is there was a group of women who actually proposed cutting off their hair and selling it overseas and then using that money to fund the war. If they ran out of dishes, a lot of women would just use gourds and replace. So they were really trying to be resourceful to the very end. But, it just wasn't enough. So the North, because they won the war in the end, spoiler alert, the North's economic policies really took hold. So even after the war, we see high tariffs, and we see kind of a full-fledged industrial revolution take place in the United States. Because after the war, the North really doesn't have to make any compromises economically with the South. So we see that. Okay, so I think this concludes this chapter. Like I said, this chapter was really more about the economics of the war, the politics of the war, and then this next chapter we'll see next will be more of like the battles the war actually fought itself.